Imagine this. You are traveling on an ancient road, choked with yellow dust. The midday sun is a ball of fire, scorching the earth. You are cloaked in a Roman-style traveling cape, and the horse beneath you snorts impatiently. Around you, your attendants watch you with eyes full of awe. But you feel neither the heat nor the fatigue, because in your heart burns a fire hotter than the sun, a fire forged from a sense of mission, a sense of justice, and a sense of absolute certainty. Your destination is the great city to the north, Damascus. Your business is not trade, nor is it tourism. It is a cleansing. In your pocket, you carry arrest warrants signed by the highest religious council, authorizing you to uproot a burgeoning sect, a movement seen as a plague. You are intimately familiar with every detail of this mission, and you harbor not a single shred of doubt about its righteousness. Because you are the old world's sharpest scalpel, sent to cut out the new world's most dangerous tumor. You are Saul, Saul of Tarsus. Now, before we officially begin, we need to do a little background check on this gentleman. Otherwise, you won't grasp just how earth-shattering his later transformation truly was. Whatever you do, don't picture Saul as some simple-minded thug with more muscle than brains. No, he was the absolute opposite. A top-tier elite of his society, a golden boy with a resume that would make anyone jealous. First, his background. He was born in the great Roman city of Tarsus, a renowned academic center of its time, like a modern-day Oxford or Cambridge. He came from a well-to-do family, but more importantly, he was born with what was then the ultimate passport, Roman citizenship. What does that mean? It meant that within the empire, he enjoyed legal privileges, could travel freely, and could appeal his case directly to Caesar. No local magistrate could touch him without cause. This provided him enormous advantages in his later life. Next, his education. As a young man, he was sent to Jerusalem to study under the most revered rabbi of the age, Gamaliel. To put that in perspective, Gamaliel was the Confucius of the Jewish world, and Saul was one of his star pupils. He was a Pharisee of Pharisees, a brilliant scholar who had memorized Jewish law and theology backward and forward. His logic was airtight, his debating skills were formidable, and his mind was quicker than anyone's. Finally, his faith. He was a staunch defender of Jewish tradition. In an era of Roman occupation and pervasive Greek culture, the entire Jewish nation was suffering from an identity crisis. Saul was the purest and most fervent kind of cultural conservative. He believed that the Jewish people were God's chosen people because they had the law, the Torah. This was the core of their identity. And this new sect called Christianity, in Saul's eyes, it was utterly heretical. They proclaimed that a man crucified on a cross was the Messiah, which shook the very foundations of Judaism. They said faith in this man was enough, that the law was no longer paramount, and this was a betrayal of the entire Jewish tradition. So you see, in his own worldview, Saul's actions were 100% righteous. He wasn't driven by power or money. He was defending everything he loved with the intellectual purity of a scholar and the passion of a martyr. He was the old order's most loyal and most formidable champion. For a man like this, with a will of steel and a perfectly closed loop of logic, what kind of force would it take to break him? So, how did this golden boy end up on this bloody path of persecution? The story begins with a brutal trial. At the time, there was a deacon in the church named Stephen. He was an eloquent and charismatic man, a rising star in the early church. Naturally, his prominence made him a target. He was arrested and charged with blasphemy against the temple and the law. Before the council, Stephen gave a fiery defense, recounting the history of the Jewish people from Abraham to the present day, accusing the religious leaders of being stiff-necked and resisting the Holy Spirit. He'd just poked the hornet's nest. The men of the council were furious and dragged him out of the city. And our Saul? He was right there. He didn't throw a single stone himself, but he did something that spoke even more to his status. Those who did the stoning laid their cloaks at his feet for safekeeping. This was an act of trust, an endorsement. Saul stood there, his young face grim and resolute, giving his approval to the execution. He believed it was a necessary act of purification. And then, the crucial moment. Under a hail of stones, Stephen didn't curse or cry out in pain. He fell to his knees and, echoing Jesus on the cross, shouted, "Lord, do not hold this sin against them." With that, he died. Think about what Saul witnessed. He saw a heretic, in his final moments, display a transcendent peace, strength, and an unbelievable love. Did this match the image in his head of a silver-tongued cultist who deceived the masses? Not at all. In that moment, a profound contradiction, like a tiny seed, was quietly planted in his heart of stone. This is the psychological concept we mentioned earlier, cognitive dissonance. When your core belief, for example, these people are wrong and evil, violently clashes with observable reality, for example, but they die like saints, your mind enters a state of extreme discomfort and confusion. To resolve this discomfort, people usually have three options. First, change your belief and admit you were wrong. For an elite like Saul, that was nearly impossible. Second, change your behavior and stop the persecution. That would mean negating his entire life's mission. So, he chose the third and most common option. He doubled down to rationalize his actions. What must he have thought? He would tell himself, Stephen's peace must be a demonic deception. The more they act this way, the more it proves how deceitful they are. Not only am I not wrong, but my mission is even more urgent and important than I imagined. I must intensify my efforts to exterminate this terrifying masquerade. You see, this explains his subsequent actions. After Stephen's death, Saul's persecution of the church didn't weaken, it escalated into a frenzy. As the scripture says, he began to destroy the church. Going from house to house, he dragged off both men and women and put them in prison. He became an out-of-control, high-speed cleansing machine. This frantic external behavior was the direct manifestation of his massive internal conflict and dissonance. The more he doubted, the more certain he had to appear. The more he feared, the more ruthless he had to become. His psyche was like a pressure cooker with the heat turned all the way up. On the outside, it looked indestructible, but inside, the pressure was building exponentially. He thought he was the embodiment of justice, little knowing he was pushing himself, step by step, to the brink of a complete mental breakdown. And that dusty, sun-baked road to Damascus was the release valve on that fateful pressure cooker, about to blow. He thought he was the hunter on a mission. He had no idea that he was the real prey. And so, on that road to Damascus, at high noon, when the sun was at its most punishing, the valve on that pressure cooker was blown clean off by a force from beyond. A light from heaven, brighter than the sun, flashed around him without warning. Think about that for a moment. This is a brightness that defies the physics of our world. It wasn't just light, it was like a celestial sledgehammer, a hammer forged of pure energy and will, brought down with pinpoint accuracy on the crown of Saul's psyche. He fell to the ground. His companions were stunned. They heard the sound but saw no one. And Saul, the indomitable religious enforcer, for the first and last time, heard the voice that would change him and the world forever. The voice didn't boom with thunderous rage. Instead, it carried a deep, almost sorrowful question. Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? Folks, the destructive power of that question was nuclear. First, it called him by name, a direct, personal strike. Second, it didn't say, why do you persecute my followers? It said, why do you persecute me? In an instant, that question shattered the entire fortress of logic and law that Saul had built around himself. He had always believed he was rooting out a band of heretics to defend God. But this voice from heaven was telling him, all your self-proclaimed righteousness, all your good deeds, were, in fact, direct attacks on me, the very God you claim to be defending. In that moment, Saul's worldview, the great edifice of his life, his entire proud identity from its foundation to its roof, utterly collapsed into dust. Everything that was once right became wrong. Everything that was glorious became sinful. This devastating blow was immediately reflected in his body. When he got up from the ground, he was blind. This blindness is profoundly symbolic. A man who thought he saw everything with perfect clarity was now plunged into total physical darkness. This mirrored the state of his soul. Everything he had seen, everything he had believed in, had just been proven to be a lie. In the most decisive way imaginable, God had turned off his external monitor, forcing him to look inward, to confront the true battlefield within his own soul. He was led by the hand into Damascus. The next 3 days, 72 hours, were the most critical of Saul's life. In that pitch-black darkness, he did not eat or drink. He was completely isolated. What was he thinking? What was he experiencing? We can make a reasonable guess. I believe that in that darkness, for the first time in his life, he truly saw the people he had persecuted. He no longer saw them as faceless heretic symbols, but as specific, suffering, yet unbelievably resolute human beings. He saw Stephen's forgiveness under the stones. He saw the terror in the eyes of children as he dragged their parents from their homes. He saw the figures of those who still prayed and sang in the prisons he had thrown them into. The articles of law he had used to judge others now became the ironclad evidence used to judge himself. His proud intellect was proof of his foolishness. His zealous passion was proof of his cruelty. This was an excruciating process of skinning himself alive. The old Saul, the elite, the scholar, the defender, was, in those 3 days of darkness, systematically tortured and put to death by his own hand. This is the death that must precede rebirth. You must first admit that your old self is utterly bankrupt before a new self can possibly emerge. 3 days later, the turning point came. There was a Christian in the city named Ananias. He received a vision telling him to go and find Saul, the bogeyman that all the believers in the city feared. Ananias's first reaction was fear and refusal, which is completely normal. It was like being asked to deliver a meal to your own executioner, but in the end, he chose to obey. When Ananias found Saul, placed his hands on him, and said, "Brother Saul," the story reaches a deeply moving climax. A member of the hunted willingly approached the hunter, not with hatred or vengeance, but with the word brother, bringing healing and acceptance. This love from his former enemy became the final and most crucial piece in the reconstruction of Saul's new world. Immediately, something like scales fell from Saul's eyes, and he could see again. This seeing was twofold. He not only regained his physical sight, but more importantly, he gained a completely new vision, a new way of seeing the world, of seeing others, and of seeing himself. He got up and was baptized, and then he made a final ceremonial decision to break with his past. He traded his Hebrew name Saul, a name full of both glory and sin, for a common Roman name, Paul. This name change is a classic example of what we've called narrative self-creation. He was declaring, "The story of Saul is over. From this day forward, I will use the rest of my life to write a new story, the story of Paul." And the theme of that story will no longer be defend, but devote, no longer judge, but grace, no longer persecute, but save. With that, Paul's system reboot and self-reconstruction were on a spiritual level complete. He had become a new creation, with a new heart, but with the same formidable mind. But when a new you is born, does the world automatically accept it? No. You still have to use your actions and pay a price to write the truest footnotes for your new story. And that is the beginning of the next, even more epic chapter of Paul's life. When a new you is born, everyone around you is still working from the old user manual. They will see you through the old lens, judge you by the old standards, and doubt you based on old memories. If you want them to believe you've truly changed, words are not nearly enough. You have to bring something real to the table, some hard currency. And for Paul, the hard currency he used to prove himself for the rest of his life was suffering. Paul's transformation did not bring him flowers and applause. It threw him into a perilous, two-front war. He found himself caught in a vice, squeezed between two massive forces of hostility. The first force came from his former comrades, the leaders and zealots of Judaism. In their eyes, Paul was not a simple convert. He was the most despicable of traitors. Their star agent, a man who understood their laws and inner workings better than anyone, had defected to the enemy. The threat was too great. He had to be eliminated, physically, at all cost. Shortly after his conversion in Damascus, the local Jews conspired to kill him. They watched the city gates day and night, waiting to trap him. In the end, his new friends had to lower him in a large basket from an opening in the city wall at night, allowing him to escape with his life. Picture that. An elite who once carried the highest arrest warrants and walked with an air of authority, now being dangled in a basket like a piece of cargo in a desperate escape. This was the first gift of his new identity. And that was just the beginning. He fled to Jerusalem, hoping to connect with his new colleagues. Instead, he was met with the second, and perhaps more disheartening force of hostility, suspicion and fear from within the Christian community. When the believers in Jerusalem heard Saul is here, their first reaction wasn't "Welcome, new brother," but "Lock the doors, run, it's a trap." They were all afraid of him. They hid from him. No one believed his conversion was genuine. They thought it had to be a new trick from the devious Saul, an undercover plot to infiltrate their ranks and destroy them from within. During that time, Paul was arguably the loneliest man in the world. The old world wanted him dead, and the new world wouldn't let him in. He was like an incompatible piece of software that couldn't run on any computer. It was at this critical moment that an angel investor named Barnabas appeared. Barnabas was a well-respected and kind-hearted man in the church. He was the only one brave enough to approach Paul, to listen to his story, and ultimately to believe him. He vouched for Paul and introduced him to the apostles. Only then did Paul finally find a foothold in his new world. But to prove yourself, a single recommendation is not enough. In the years to follow, you must use your own actions to present a testimony that no one can deny. And the resume of Paul's later life is a testimony written in blood and tears. Later in his letters, in a rare moment that almost sounds like defiance, he listed the sufferings he endured for his faith. That list is chilling to even read. "I've worked much harder, been in prison more frequently, been flogged more severely, and been exposed to death again and again. 5 times I received from the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was pelted with stones. 3 times I was shipwrecked. I spent a night and a day in the open sea. I have been constantly on the move. I have been in danger from rivers, in danger from bandits, in danger from my fellow Jews, in danger from Gentiles, in danger in the city, in danger in the country, in danger at sea, and in danger from false believers." Folks, that's not a resume. It's an encyclopedia of torture. Let's just pick one item from that list. Once, I was pelted with stones. One time, Paul and Barnabas were preaching in the city of Lystra. He healed a man who had been lame from birth. When the local crowd saw this, they went wild, thinking the Greek gods Zeus and Hermes had come down to earth. They brought bulls and wreaths and were about to offer sacrifices to them. Paul and Barnabas had to tear their clothes and rush out into the crowd to stop them. But then a few Jews who had been chasing them from other cities arrived. With a few words, they turned the very same crowd that had just tried to worship them into a vicious mob. The fickleness of human nature can be that swift. The mob picked up stones and began to pelt Paul. They beat him so savagely that, believing he was dead, they dragged him outside the city and left him there. The disciples gathered around him, thinking they were preparing his body for burial. But then a miracle happened. Paul, a bloody mess of a man, staggered to his feet. And what did he do next? He didn't run. He didn't find a safe place to recover. He dusted himself off, and the very next day, he walked with Barnabas right back into the city that had just tried to stone him to death, to continue strengthening the disciples' faith. What kind of spiritual power is that? What kind of will? This brings us back to our core point. The price you pay is the truest test of your conviction. You can understand this feeling. Why do we cherish something we bought with money we saved for a long time? Why does a relationship that has overcome great obstacles feel more profound? Because the human psyche works this way. We don't make huge sacrifices for things we don't value. Conversely, the greater the sacrifice we make, the more we value it. And the more we convince ourselves that it was all worth it. For Paul, these hardships were no longer something to be passively endured, but an active and glorious offering. Every flogging carved a deeper mark of his new identity. Every imprisonment provided a more solid chapter for his new story. He wasn't suffering. He was using his own flesh and blood to declare to a doubting world over and over again, "See, this is my answer. This is the price I willingly pay for my faith." Now, do you still doubt its authenticity? When a person can see suffering itself as part of his mission, as a badge of honor, he becomes truly invincible. He had forged himself into the new faith's sharpest and most unbreakable sword. But just having this grit isn't enough. To change the world, you need top-tier wisdom and a blueprint. And this is the even more astonishing other side of Paul. That's right, folks. A man's will, no matter how strong, if he's just fighting alone, makes him a tragic hero at best, a Don Quixote. But Paul was not that. Not only could he withstand the world's malice with sheer grit, but he also possessed a brilliant, cool-headed mind, the mind of a master architect. In his heart, he carried a grand blueprint, one capable of changing the entire global landscape. If the first half of Paul's life was that of a soldier, charging into the fray with his own body, then the second half was that of an architect. determined to build the foundational pillars for the new world he believed in. We joked earlier that Paul was the CEO of the startup called Christianity. That analogy is not an exaggeration. For a startup to survive and grow, passion isn't enough. You need a strategy. And Paul's strategy, even when analyzed with today's most advanced business thinking, is a textbook case of genius. Let's take a look at his 3 masterstrokes. Masterstroke Hasson, decisively break out of the bubble, redefining the core user. Before Paul, the prototype of Christianity was essentially an innovative branch of Judaism. Its user base was extremely niche, ethnic Jews. The barrier to entry was incredibly high. To join, you not only had to believe in Jesus, but you also had to follow the entire complex set of Jewish laws, circumcision, Sabbath observance, dietary restrictions, and so on. It's like a piece of software that requires you to first buy a specific, expensive brand of computer and learn a complex programming language. How could that ever be scalable? Paul, with his international perspective as a Roman citizen, keenly saw the fatal flaw in this model. It could never become a world religion. So he made the boldest and most controversial strategic decision of all. The core product, faith in Jesus, must be completely unbundled from the complex operating system of Jewish law. He faced immense pressure from within the church, engaging in fierce debates with the Jerusalem HQ, led by Peter and James. In the end, he won the argument, establishing a revolutionary principle. Non-Jews, the Gentiles, did not need to become Jews first. They could get there in one step, becoming Christians through faith alone. This move was the equivalent of taking a region-locked product and turning it into a free, international version. Its target audience instantly expanded from a few million Jews to the tens of millions of Greeks, Romans, Egyptians, and Syrians across the Roman Empire. Without this step of breaking out of the bubble, Christianity would have been, at best, a fleeting ripple in the long river of Jewish history. This was a strategic vision of life or death importance. Masterstroke #2, a disruptive innovation, creating an irresistible value proposition. Okay, so the barrier to entry is lowered. Anyone can come in, but why should they? The spiritual landscape of the Roman Empire was a fiercely competitive red ocean market. You had the official state religion of the Roman gods and emperor worship, various Eastern mystery cults, and lofty Greek philosophy for the intellectual class. What was the core selling point of this new product? The value proposition Paul offered was simple, lethal, and went straight for the heart. It was the word we mentioned before, grace. In the spiritual marketplace of the time, this was an absolute game changer. Think about it. Every other religion and philosophy was essentially a merit-based system. You either had to appease the gods with sacrifices and bribes, or you had to climb the moral ladder through ascetic practices and strict rules, or you had to attain enlightenment through profound wisdom. No matter the path, for the common person, especially slaves, women, and the poor, it was too difficult. Paul just flipped the whole table over. He said, "None of that is necessary. Salvation is not a KPI you earn through your performance. It is a gift, given freely and unconditionally by God. Your only task is to reach out your hand and accept it through faith. Before this gift, slave and master are equal, man and woman are equal, Greek and Jew are equal. For the rigidly hierarchical and often hopeless society of the ancient world, this value proposition was devastatingly attractive. It gave the most valueless people a supreme identity. It gave the most hopeless people a certain hope. It was truly good news for everyone. Masterstroke #3, strategic rollout, building a scalable distributed network. With a clear user base and a core product, the final pieces are channel and distribution. Paul's missionary journeys were not random wanderings. They followed a well-thought-out strategic expansion map. The cities he chose were almost all the most important commercial, cultural, and transportation hubs of the Roman Empire. Ephesus, Corinth, Thessalonica, and finally, the heart of the empire itself, Rome. He brilliantly leveraged the infrastructure of the empire, the famous Roman roads. These cities had high traffic and rapid information flow. By establishing a base in one hub, the ideas could spread like ripples along the trade routes to all surrounding areas. Even more brilliant was his organizational model. The church he established in each city was not his downline. They were self-sustaining, self-replicating community nodes. He then managed this growing network remotely by writing letters. The epistles we read in the New Testament today were his internal memos and training manuals sent to the various branch offices. The advantage of this model is its incredible resilience. It's decentralized. The entire network wouldn't collapse just because the founder was arrested or killed. So you see, one person's energy is finite, but a network that can replicate itself has infinite potential. With these three masterstrokes, a clear blueprint emerges. Start with a universal, bubble-breaking concept. Use an incredibly attractive story of grace as the core product, and expand through a replicable, distributed network. This playbook, even 2,000 years later, remains the unshakable underlying logic behind every great movement and successful business. Of course, we must stress again that Paul was able to do all this because, at his core, he had a 1,000% sincere belief in everything he preached, a belief he was willing to back up with his own life. His wisdom was the weapon of his faith. His suffering was the badge of his brand. When one person's mind, heart, and body are all burning for the same goal, the energy they can unleash is enough to move the world. The story we've told today, having reached this point, is truly coming to a close. We have followed in Paul's footsteps along a long and winding road. We saw how the most steadfast defender of the old world was under a blinding light, shattered along with his entire reality. We saw how, in 3 days of darkness, he killed his former self and, through the acceptance of an enemy, forged a new soul. We saw how he used the scars and chains of his later life to carve out the most undeniable proof of his new identity. And finally, we saw how, with the mind of a master, he drew the blueprint for the new world he believed in, a blueprint that would last for millennia. So, who was Paul, really? He was a sinner, and he was a saint. He was a fervent believer, and he was a cool-headed strategist. He was a mortal man struck down by God, and he was a superman who, with his own will, changed the landscape of God on earth. The contradictions within him are precisely what make him so uniquely compelling. Today, we use the key of cognitive dissonance to unlock the door to his inner transformation. We use the lens of narrative psychology to understand his courage in reconstructing himself. We even use the perspective of business strategy to analyze his methods for changing the world. Why did we do all this? To pull Paul down from his pedestal? No, quite the opposite. It was to allow all of you to see more clearly just how much energy can erupt from within a single mortal body. To what extremes can a person's conviction be tested? What incredible miracles can one human life create? In the end, Paul's story points to a question that none of us can avoid. It's not about whether you are religious, but about what you truly believe in. In your life, is there something, an idea, a cause, a person, or a truth you hold dear that you feel is worth paying a great price for? Worth enduring misunderstanding, fighting against the world, and even completely shattering the you of the past? Perhaps we will never encounter that mysterious, blinding light on the road to Damascus. But in our own lives, we will all face moments that shake our deepest certainties and make us doubt everything we once believed. Those moments are our own Damascus. At that crossroads, do we choose to keep patching up an old self that is already full of cracks? Or do we find the courage to step into that unknown darkness and forge a new one? Paul gave his answer. He proved with his entire life that a person can not only be changed, but can also actively, thoroughly, and magnificently recreate themselves. And a person who has completed that recreation can unleash enough energy to cast an eternal shadow in the long river of history. The story is finished. I hope this potent wine of Paul's story, aged for 2,000 years, has brought a spark of warmth to your heart, or perhaps the bracing sting of clarity. Thank you all for listening so patiently. Until we meet again on the road.